Okay, so get this. Today we're diving into um, some pretty fascinating historical parallels. We're going to be looking at how U.S. presidents leave office, those exits, and comparing them to, believe it or not, Roman leaders.
That's a little out there, huh?
I know, right?
Eh.
But stick with me. The source material we're using for this deep dive is actually a podcast episode. It's from The Rest is History, and it was recorded by historians. They're called Tom Holland and Dominic Sambrook.
Oh, yeah, I know them. They're great.
Yeah, so we'll just call them Holland and Sambrook for simplicity's sake. But what's really cool about this episode is that it was recorded like right as the 2020 election results were coming in. So it's like this amazing time capsule.
Wow, so we're getting real-time reactions.
Exactly. Raw emotions, anxieties about the future of American democracy. They even start comparing Trump to Nixon, which is, pretty intriguing.
I can only imagine. So are there any specific insights from this episode that we should be paying attention to?
Oh yeah, tons. But first, let me set the scene a bit. Sambrook is actually a Nixon expert, and both he and Holland, well, they're both really into Roman history.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. A Nixon expert and Roman history buffs talking about the 2020 election. There are bound to be some interesting parallels.
You got it. And one of the first parallels they draw, and it's kind of the obvious one,
Mm,
is that both Trump and Nixon left office, well, let's just say, not very gracefully. There was a bit of controversy surrounding both of their departures.
yeah, neither one of them exactly accepted defeat with, humility. A bit of a tantrum, you could say.
Totally. And there's this really funny detail in the episode. Trump actually got the news of Biden's victory while he was on the golf course.
Oh, no, really? I bet the internet had a field day with that.
Oh, for sure. All the bunker and dictator jokes started flying around.
Yeah, I can see that. And probably some Hitler comparisons thrown in for good measure.
You know it. But Holland and Sambrook actually point out that the Hitler comparisons, well, they're pretty historically flawed.
Right, right. I can see how that would be a bit of a stretch.
But they do mention this funny little detail that both Hitler and Trump were, like, super picky about their food.
Really? That's kind of a strange coincidence. But I guess not exactly a profound historical parallel.
Not really, more of a funny footnote.
Yeah.
But speaking of Nixon, I think it's worth diving a little deeper into his story here. Like, his presidency is super relevant to this whole discussion.
Hmm.
And as I mentioned, Sambrook actually taught a whole year-long course on Nixon, so he's like the Nixon whisperer.
A whole year on Nixon. Wow, okay. I'm all ears. But fill me in on why Nixon's presidency is so fascinating, especially in the context of our discussion today.
Well, so Nixon's career is basically this incredible arc. He starts out campaigning as this, law and order candidate,
Hmm.
promising stability, a return to traditional values, all that. And then bam, Watergate happens. And his image is just completely shattered.
Yeah.
Leads to his resignation, the whole 9 yards.
It's almost like a Shakespearean tragedy, a rise and fall of epic proportions.
Yeah, totally. But there's this one key difference between Nixon and Trump that I find really interesting. Nixon actually won the election, like by a landslide. In 72, it wasn't even close.
Right, which makes his downfall even more dramatic, right? Like
Oh,
this
yeah.
guy was at the peak of his power and then boom, it all came crashing down.
Exactly. I mean, in 1972, he won every single state except for Massachusetts and D.C. Think about that. It was this massive display of public support, a clear mandate from the American people. And just a couple years later, he's forced to resign.
It really makes you wonder how quickly public opinion can shift, how fragile power really is. Makes me think about how Nixon must reacted when he realized his presidency was on the line. Did he cling to power as desperately as Trump did?
Right. Like, how hard did he fight to hold on?
Well, the thing about Watergate is that it was this slow burn political crisis that just dragged on for months and months. Nixon was like desperately trying to cover up his involvement, but the truth just kept trickling out bit by bit. And even when those infamous incriminating tapes came out, he still resisted resigning for like a year and a half.
A year and a half.
Yeah.
Wow, talk about digging your heels in. His final days in office must have been chaotic.
Oh, absolutely. Legal battles, public apologies, all this behind-the-scenes maneuvering. There are even accounts of him having a breakdown on live television during his farewell speech to his staff.
Wow, so it sounds like both Nixon and Trump really pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable presidential behavior. Like they didn't really care about playing by the rules.
Yeah, that's a fascinating parallel for sure. They both violated these unspoken codes of conduct that had governed American politics for decades. It was like they didn't even understand the rules of the game, or maybe they just didn't respect them.
That's a good point. And speaking of rules and traditions, it makes me think about the founding fathers and how obsessed they were with Roman history. They were always looking to the past, like for guidance on how to build this stable republic. They even dressed Washington in a toga for that famous statue.
That's right. They were hugely influenced by the Romans, especially this concept called mos maiorum. It means the customs of the ancestors. And it basically emphasized the importance of tradition, respecting what came before you.
Yeah, like they were trying to build a system that would prevent a Caesar figure from taking over, right? That fear of a powerful leader, undermining the republic. It seems like that anxiety runs through like all of American history.
Absolutely. That fear was very real for them. They'd just fought a war to get away from a king, so they were determined to create a system that would prevent any one person from having too much power. And they thought that by studying Roman history, they could learn from the mistakes of the past and avoid repeating them.
It's like they were saying, here's a republic, now try to keep it. I think that was Benjamin Franklin, right? But didn't they also elect, like, generals as president? I'm thinking Andrew Jackson and Eisenhower. Wasn't that kind of contradictory?
It is a bit ironic. They were terrified of a Caesar figure, but then they often turned to military leaders in times of crisis.
So was it okay because they were serving the republic, not trying to exploit it? Kind of a fine line there.
And I guess so. And speaking of generals, John McCain's story is super interesting here. He was this war hero, a senator, and a presidential candidate who really embodied a lot of those classic Roman virtues: duty, honor, courage, the whole shebang. And Holland actually met him in person. He mentions it in the podcast.
Wow, no way. Okay, tell me more about McCain. What makes him such a Roman figure in American politics?
Well, he was known for being, stoic. He had these unwavering principles. He'd stand up for what he believed in, even when it was, like, really unpopular.
Yeah, I remember that.
And, he was captured and tortured during the Vietnam War, but he refused to be released before any of his fellow prisoners.
That's intense.
Yeah, a real display of loyalty and selflessness.
It makes Trump's comment about him even more shocking, right? That whole "I like people who aren't captured" thing. It's just so, like, fundamentally un-Roman when you think about it.
Oh, yeah, it was a jarring moment for sure. Just a total clash of values. And McCain's funeral, that was really something. You had Democrats and Republicans all coming together, united.
I remember that. It felt like the whole country was mourning.
Yeah, and it was this, like, powerful rejection of Trump's rhetoric. It was a real symbolic moment.
Totally. It really highlights how divided things were.
Yeah.
It makes me think about this Roman concept, the boni, which means the good men, versus the populares, the ones who appeal to the people, often by, like, stirring up resentment and division. Didn't both Nixon and Trump kind of use that kind of populism to their advantage?
Oh, absolutely. They both presented themselves as these champions of the common man, fighting against the elites, which is kind of ironic considering they were both super wealthy and powerful.
Yeah, it's like textbook populism, right?
Straight out of the Roman playbook. They knew how to tap into those frustrations and anxieties, that feeling of being left behind.
Makes me wonder, does that make them comparable to Roman emperors like Caligula or Nero? I vaguely remember those names from history class. Weren't they, a bit unhinged?
Well, you got to be careful with direct comparisons, but
Right.
there are some interesting similarities. Like, take Caligula, he'd mock the Senate, he'd put on these lavish games and spectacles.
And Nero, he was the one who fiddled while Rome burned. Right?
That's probably just a myth. But he did perform in public, which was, like, unheard of for an emperor. Can you imagine Trump headlining Glastonbury?
Yeah, kind of. So they all understood the power of putting on a show, playing to the crowd, a little bit of, what's the word, showmanship.
For sure. They knew that politics isn't just about policy. It's about image. It's about storytelling.
Yeah.
About connecting with people. And they were all masters at manipulating that.
It makes me wonder how history will judge them. Caligula was assassinated, right? Generally portrayed as a tyrant. Will Trump go down in the history books the same way?
Hard to say. But even though Caligula was, like, hated by the Roman elite, some people actually mourned him. He had this charisma that transcended his flaws, It's possible Trump will be remembered similarly.
So you're saying Trumpism as, like, a political force, it might outlive Trump himself. Like, could we see a new Trump emerge?
It's a big question. But it's worth noting that even though Nixon was disgraced by Watergate, his political strategies, appealing to resentment against elites, that stuff had a huge impact on American politics.
It's true. You saw a lot of his tactics adopted by Republicans, like Reagan, even Trump himself. Kind of like a political echo.
Yeah, and it shows how these ideas can resonate across generations, how powerful they can be. Makes you think Trumpism might be more than just a passing fad.
That's a bit unsettling. Like, even if the person fades away, the ideas, the movement, it just keeps going.
Exactly. Which is why it's so important to understand the historical context. See how these patterns have played out before. Helps make sense of the present and prepare for the future.
So going back to that Rest is History episode, what did Holland and Sambrook ultimately conclude about the Trump-Roman history parallels?
Well, they were obviously struck by the drama, the chaos of Trump's final days. Remember that whole thing with the press conference?
Four Seasons Total Landscaping? Oh yeah, that was wild. Not exactly the Four Seasons Hotel.
Total absurdity. And they contrasted it with this image of Caesar crossing the Rubicon.
It was a big moment, right? Like a turning point in Roman history.
Huge. Caesar defies the Senate, marches his army towards Rome, basically starts a civil war. And they were pointing out the difference in scale and consequence.
Right. Trump faced legal troubles leaving office, but he wasn't exactly leading an army.
Exactly. Plus, he didn't have the military support to actually hold on to power, unlike Caesar. So in the end, his downfall was more farcical than tragic.
So they were saying that even though there were these echoes of Roman history in Trump's presidency, the American system, with its checks and balances, it actually held up.
Yeah, I think that's the takeaway. They recognized the anxieties people felt, but they were also cautiously optimistic about the resilience of American democracy.
Okay, that makes sense. But didn't they also raise questions about the future? Like, even if Trump fades away, will the things that allowed him to rise to power, will those forces still be there?
Oh, absolutely. They left us with this question. Will Trumpism, like Nixon's legacy, endure, even if Trump himself becomes a footnote in history? And that's something we all have to think about.
Yeah, it's not just about one person, it's about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from this Roman history comparison, to help us understand where American politics might be headed?
Well, I think the big takeaway is we can't take democracy for granted. It's a fragile thing, needs constant attention. The Romans learned that the hard way, and we can't repeat their mistakes.
So we all have to be more engaged, more informed, more willing to stand up for what we believe in.
Exactly. Be aware of the warning signs, the things that can weaken democracy from the inside, and be ready to defend those institutions, hold our leaders accountable, and make sure they stick to the Constitution.
It's a lot to ask, but it feels like the stakes are pretty high.
They are. The Roman Republic, for all its flaws, it was an incredible achievement, lasted for centuries, had a huge impact on Western civilization.
It's a legacy that's still inspiring. Reminds us that self-government is a precious thing, and it's a serious responsibility.
And it's something we got to fight for, nurture it, defend it against anyone who tries to weaken it, especially now.
So wrapping up this deep dive, I'm really struck by how fragile democracy is. And I feel, I don't know, more grateful for the people who fought to protect it, from the founding fathers to those speaking out today, defending its principles.
I hope our listener feels that same sense of urgency, that they realize the future of our republic is in our hands. We can shape it, protect it, make sure it lasts.
Yeah, it's a responsibility we can't ignore. History has shown us that it's a journey with challenges and opportunities. So, stay engaged, stay informed, and most importantly, stay hopeful. And keep looking to history for guidance, for inspiration.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We can learn so much from those who came before us, from their successes and their failures. It's up to us to use that knowledge to build a better future.
It feels like we've just scratched the surface here. I mean, this whole Roman-American comparison, it's amazing how many parallels there are.
It really is. It's like you're holding up this warped mirror to the present. You see those shapes, those patterns from Roman history. But it can be kind of disturbing.
Yeah, it's that feeling you get when you study history. It's not just names and dates. It's about understanding, I don't know, like human nature, those cycles of power and ambition, and how fragile even civilizations can be.
Exactly. And Rome, well, it's a reminder that even empires can crumble. Republics can be vulnerable. I mean, they had internal divisions, outside pressures.
So looking back at Rome, what lessons can we take away? What should we be watching out for as Americans?
Well, I think the big one is be careful about the cult of personality. The Romans, they loved a charismatic leader, the kind who promised them glory and prosperity.
But those promises don't always work out so well.
Nope. Often led to tyranny, chaos.
Sounds familiar. It's a cautionary tale, for sure. Something to keep in mind with, American politics always changing.
Totally. We also got to pay attention to inequality and corruption. Those things, they plagued Rome, really played a part in its downfall.
And of course, civic engagement, right? The Romans, they had this concept, virtus, duty, courage, serving the common good.
Oh, yeah, like that JFK quote, right? Ask not what your country.
Exactly. Those values, they were like essential for Rome. And they're crucial today, too. If we want to protect our democracy, can't just sit back and watch.
You got to participate, hold our leaders accountable, demand that they uphold the Constitution.
It's a tall order, for sure. But, I mean, it feels like the stakes, they couldn't be higher.
They really aren't. The Roman Republic, it wasn't perfect, but it was like an incredible thing, lasted for centuries, left this huge mark on the world.
And it's a legacy that still, still inspires, reminds us that self-government, it's a gift and a responsibility.
And it's something you got to actively fight for, protect it, defend it against anyone who tries to weaken it, especially now.
So I got to say, as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm walking away with this feeling of, wow, democracy is fragile. And I'm feeling more grateful for everyone who's fought to protect it, from the founding fathers to people today.
I hope our listener feels that too, that sense of we got to do something, that the future is in our hands, that we can shape it, protect it.
It's a responsibility we can't just brush off. History shows us that, there are challenges, but there's opportunities too.
Yeah.
So stay engaged, stay informed, and stay hopeful. Don't forget to look to the past, for guidance, for inspiration.
Couldn't agree more. Learn from those who came before, the good and the bad. Use it to build a better future. That's what it's all about.